Hi everyone, my name is Sebastian Dettman. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Singapore Management University, and today as part of the Politics in Action conference, I'm going to give a brief update on political developments in Malaysia over the past year. But for the most part, I'm going to be trying to explain some of the momentous political events which took place in Malaysia just a couple months ago. So the sort of headline development in Malaysian politics over the past year since the last update is definitely the collapse of the former ruling coalition under Pakatan Harapan, the Alliance of Hope, which was led by Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, and the installment of a new government, now called Perikatan Nasional, or National Alliance, under the man on the left, Muhyiddin Yassin, who is now the new prime minister. And there's any number of quite unexpected parts of this new configuration. One of them is that there was no election which led to this change. In fact, this was done without an election and even without a parliamentary sitting. And also, Muhyiddin Yassin and some of the new coalition are in fact from the former Alliance of Hope coalition, and also represent some of the parties and political entities which were voted out in the 2018 elections. So basically, today's presentation will be trying to understand how this happened, why we saw this collapse of the Alliance of Hope government, and what it means for Malaysia going forward. So let me just briefly review the political map in 2019 in Malaysia, which is basically the same that we saw in 2018 as well. So in May of 2018, of course, there were the foundational elections, which led to the voting out of the National Front coalition, and they were decisively defeated by the Alliance of Hope coalition led by Mahathir Mohamad. And the Alliance of Hope itself is comprised of four parties, or was comprised of four parties, allied with parties in East Malaysia. And this coalition, of course, unseated the long-running National Front coalition, which was led by the dominant party UMNO. So if you want a background on those dynamics of 2018 and the first year of the Alliance of Hope, I recommend that you watch the previous two Politics in Action updates, which will cover this in a lot more detail. So I'm just going to gloss over a lot of the details right now. But suffice to say that the Alliance of Hope itself, by the time the election, in the aftermath of the election, it had a pretty solid majority of seats in parliament. And it had in fact increasingly strengthened itself by gaining a lot of parties and politicians from the former ruling party, which decided to jump ship and join the ruling coalition. On the other hand, on the opposition side, there's a number of opposition parties, but this is in this sort of simple presentation. I'm not going to talk about all the parties, but basically the main opposition that the Alliance of Hope faced were the two parties of UMNO and PAS, which are Malay Muslim parties, which restrict membership based on racial and, in the case of PAS, religious criteria, which had in 2019 formalized their cooperation. This was an element or a phenomenon which was increasingly public after the 2018 elections, but in 2019 we saw these two parties now cooperating in elections moving forward. And then also there's a number of other smaller parties and also regional parties and party coalitions from East Malaysia, which were not part of the ruling government. So basically what we had was a clear alliance, the Alliance of Hope, a clear ruling coalition which had won based on an electoral manifesto, which, despite the sort of ideological contradictions of a lot of the parties within the coalition, was nevertheless quite solid. And on the other side, an opposition which was sort of scrambling to try to figure out what messaging and how they could compete against the new government. So for this presentation, I'm just going to very briefly gloss over some of the political developments under the Alliance of Hope, and this is mostly devoted to trying to understand why the Alliance of Hope eventually collapsed. So again, if you're interested in looking at details about Alliance of Hope policies and power, there's other resources that I'd be happy to suggest. But let me just briefly review some of the accomplishments or achievements of the Alliance of Hope after its win in 2018. So in 2018 and continuing on into 2019, we saw a number of important and incremental reform achievements being made. And these included things like electoral reform. The Elections Commission was made independent, some basic parliamentary reform, some anti-corruption reform, the installment of some new and independent, impartial politicians in these important positions. At the same time, the Alliance of Hope was criticized for its slow moving on its manifesto, and some of the more important sort of fundamental foundational reforms, which many observers argue that Malaysia needs to undergo, including the reform of the state-linked company sector or the GLC sector. Nevertheless, the Alliance of Hope did put into place some important reforms during this period. But again, what we've seen after 2018 and into 2019 as well is a quick drop in erosion and popularity of the Alliance of Hope. So after the initial euphoria of the 2018 elections, the Alliance of Hope, in terms of survey response and polling, quickly lost a lot of the sheen. And there's a number of reasons for this, including the inability of the Alliance of Hope to stem some of the economic problems of Malaysia and solve some of the more fundamental cost of living issues which continue to matter for ordinary voters. Also, there's a perception that the Alliance of Hope in particular was unable to shore up its support amongst the Malay Muslim electorate, which of course is the largest and most important electorate in the country, which they had not won the majority of in the previous election. And the opposition, particularly UMNO and PAS, used this as a hammer against the new government to suggest that it was unable to take care of the majority population in the country and was seeking to erode some of the special rights and privileges of that majority. And these factors combined, as well as some other election-specific factors, led to a series of defeats of the Alliance of Hope in by-elections. There was a number after 2018 and continuing even into 2020, early 2020. And in these by-elections, the Alliance of Hope lost. And although observers have noted that by-elections in Malaysia are not necessarily great predictors of national electoral fortunes, nevertheless, this was a lot of bad press, and in retrospect seems to have signaled to some parts of the Alliance of Hope coalition that perhaps the coalition was not going to ever do well amongst these important parts of the electorate. The formalization of UMNO and PAS's cooperation in 2019 only seemed to cement, and their success in by-elections only seemed to cement this narrative that the Alliance of Hope was sort of was either stumbling or not doing as well as it should at this point. And I think a lot of this is as much the Alliance of Hope being having a lot of great expectations put on it in terms of its governance, but nevertheless, this was an important part of, in retrospect, why the Alliance of Hope lost its sheen amongst the elite members of its coalition. But finally, I think the most important problem for the Alliance of Hope, especially moving into 2020, was the issue of leadership succession. So Mahathir Mohamad, when he ascended as prime minister, promised that he was going to hand over power to Anwar Ibrahim, the man on the bottom left there. Anwar Ibrahim was a former UMNO politician, Mahathir's own deputy prime minister, but for the past 20-odd years has been an important opposition leader. and now for the first time was part of the ruling government. So Mahathir had basically stated repeatedly that he was going to hand over the prime ministership to Anwar within some unspecified time. Usually he would say it was within a year or two. But as time went on, it was increasingly clear that Mahathir was very reluctant or unwilling to hand over the premiership to Anwar. And as a result, this led to increasing, it sort of brought out the already existing factionalism within Anwar's party. And as the end of 2020 came, we saw increasingly open breaks with Anwar within his own party, which seemed to be leading to increasingly unsettled discussions about whether the viability of the Alliance of Hope and what was going to happen within the coalition. So what this all culminated in earlier, just a couple weeks ago, was a extremely tumultuous and confusing week in Malaysian politics. And again, for reasons of time, I won't go too much into the details of the timeline. Suffice to say, it was extremely confusing for observers and ordinary Malaysians trying to understand what was going on in the government. But basically, just to give a couple highlights, essentially some of the key Alliance of Hope politicians and Mahathir's own party itself, Bersatu, it openly moved to form an alternative coalition with the opposition. So Anwar's chief rival was one of the seeming architects of this move. And at that time, it was unclear what was going to happen. They met at a Sheraton hotel in suburban Kuala Lumpur, which was noted by the media, and this led to a widespread speculation about the imminent collapse of the Alliance of Hope government, which eventually came within the week. But basically, within a brief period of time, Mahathir Mohamad resigned as prime minister, and Mahathir, still representing the Alliance of Hope coalition, and Muhyiddin Yassin, a politician from Mahathir's own party, became a surprise new prime ministerial pick for this nascent opposition coalition. And so these two competing coalitions, or two competing prime ministers rather, tried to garner enough support to show that they could hold a parliamentary majority. And they both met with the king, and all of the MPs of Malaysia met with the king, and the king would then made a decision about which of these two competing prime ministers had the most support. In the event, the king decided that Muhyiddin Yassin had the most support, and he appointed him as the 8th Prime Minister of Malaysia. So without going too much into the details of this, I just want to highlight a couple important key takeaways. So first, I want to emphasize that this is a elite jockeying for power. This, despite the unpopularity amongst parts of the electorate of Malaysia about the Alliance of Hope, this was not a foreordained collapse because of unpopularity. At its heart, this was an elite jockeying for power between elements within the Alliance of Hope allying themselves with some of the opposition. So this was also not put to forward through an election that Malaysian voters could then decide which coalition they wanted to support, but rather it was done entirely, at this point, entirely through the process of being appointed by the king. So as a result, the role of the public and civil society in this change has been quite marginal. There's been no mass protest about this change in government, which in some ways could be seen as a repudiation of or a rejection of the way in which a lot of these parties and politicians were voted into office. Voters in 2018 were offered very clear coalitional alternatives. But the way this happened means that it's actually blurred the lines between coalitions quite significantly. And so the role of the legislature itself as a whole has actually been quite marginal as well. There's been no chance so far for the parliament to convene, and basically it seems that the fear, at least until recently, was that if there was a parliamentary sitting, then there might be a vote of no confidence, which would collapse the government, or at least lead to a snap election. And so, again, this is a post hoc ruling coalition, which now rules Malaysia. And it leads to some sort of odd aspects of this coalition, which we haven't seen in other coalitions in Malaysia, which I'll turn to right now. So let me just talk about what the alliance, or sorry, the National Alliance looks like in office right now. So again, we have this new ruling coalition, which is actually quite interesting in the fact that the majority of seats are held by three parties, which all claim the same core voting base, and that the Malay Muslim constituency, and that's UMNO, PAS, and Bersatu. So this is quite unusual in Malaysia's coalitional politics because usually in the pre-electoral coalitional model, um, the way that the electoral map turns out, there would be probably a more clear differentiation between which parties could contest in which seats. But in the current coalition, we have three parties very much claiming the same demographic. Although the National Alliance now has some partner parties in East Malaysia, the National Alliance itself is a pretty significant departure from the previous government in the fact that it's a lot less ethnically multi-ethnic than the Alliance of Hope. Right now, it lacks any party which has significant non-Malay representation within the alliance itself, and basically overnight the government lost, at least in the legislature, lost quite a bit of its non-Malay representation. And I'll talk very briefly at the end about what the implications of this are. And now we see the national government, or National Alliance rather, now controls 8 state governments along with its allied coalition in East Malaysia. So very quickly, the federal level politics led to a consolidation of their power at the state level. So this overturned 3 of the state governments won by the Alliance of Hope in the last election. So although the actual composition of these state governments is quite varied, it does suggest that it was a pretty significant blow to the Alliance of Hope at the state level as well. And so now we have the Alliance of Hope missing one of the most important parties in the coalition, Mahathir's Bersatu Party, and it still has the Warisan Party in Sabah at least allied with it. So let me just briefly turn to the first weeks of the National Alliance in office. As of this recording, it's been about 6.5 or 7 weeks in office now. So there's a couple developments we've seen so far. First, of course, there was a new cabinet appointed, which, in line with what I was suggesting previously about the lack of multi-ethnic representation, this new cabinet also doesn't have very much peninsular non-Malay representation. And what I mean here is ethnic Chinese Malaysian or ethnic Indian Malaysian politicians in cabinet positions. In fact, this is a very big cabinet, one of the larger cabinets Malaysia has seen, but it doesn't really have a very multi-ethnic flavor to it. There is, however, greater East Malaysian representation. How this actually will play out in terms of the perennial question of East Malaysian rights and political power at the national level remains to be seen. Very quickly, the National Alliance faced the COVID-19 pandemic, which only increased in scale after the events of late February and early March. So far, again, this is very early days, but the government has done what we've seen other world governments do, which is to put in a quite strict lockdown called the Movement Control Order, which has been running since the 18th of May and is now extended until April 28th. The government also announced a significant stimulus package, although most of this package, which is 250 billion ringgit, is in the form of loan guarantees, although it does have a portion which is for direct transfers, one-time transfers to different populations in the government, or in the different groups in the population. So the opposition has already criticized the way the government has handled this, in the sense that there has yet to be a parliamentary sitting where the opposition can offer input or monitor the disbursement of the stimulus package. And the first parliamentary sitting, which is scheduled for May 18th, um, uh, is quite late in the sense that a lot of the stimulus package money may already be dispersed by the executive without really any sort of parliamentary input. As I mentioned, the first parliamentary sitting has been delayed until the 18th of May. So um, although there are questions at the beginning of this transition whether or not there would be a vote of no confidence, opposition politicians more recently have seemed to signal that they would not try to hold a vote of no confidence. So all in all, it looks like the National Alliance actually has been helped a bit by this pandemic in the sense that it's pushed aside some questions about its performance or viability in the parliament, and it also offers a possibility for the new government to display its largesse amongst the populace at a quite uncertain time. So what comes next in Malaysia? I think it's again very early days, and we don't really know how the new government is going to perform. But I think the big question, of course, is what are the long-term economic and political consequences of the pandemic? And this is consequential because we've seen Malaysian voters to be very sensitive to economic conditions, especially sort of bread and butter economic issues. And this was part of the reason why the Barisan Nasional or National Front lost in the 2018 elections. So there's a big question of how voters are going to see the National Alliance performance in this unprecedented situation, and also how deep the economic recession is going to be in Malaysia. And there are projections now for that are coming out, which still range in terms of how deep the economic pain is going to be in Malaysia. So again, this will have a lot of consequences for the National Alliance. Second, other looming issues which come into place are how the new government is going to deal with the ethno-religious polarization and environment which has characterized recent Malaysian politics, especially after the 2018 elections. And of course, this is one of the main tools by which the former opposition in the form of UMNO and PAS would critique the Alliance of Hope government. But now that those parties are in power again, there's a real question of how they're going to balance the need to appeal to all Malaysians, or at least important electoral demographics of Malaysia, along with some of their key platforms. And not least, we can see that PAS, the Conservative Islamic Party, which is now in government, has long championed Islamic penal code and implementing that in Malaysia. So how the new government will reconcile this within the coalition and whether or not there's going to be demand from the voters for these types of policies really remains to be seen. So there's another question, of course, is how this new government is going to handle the reform agenda and prominent corruption cases, most notably that of some of the most important UMNO personnel, including Najib Razak, the former president of UMNO and former prime minister, and the current president of UMNO, and the Secretary General of UMNO, who are all undergoing corruption cases. So there's a question of how the new government will try to avoid seeming to interfere in these cases, at the same time while making sure that they're catering to the important parts of the within the ruling coalition. But I think in terms of the reform agenda, we're going to see at least definitely the slowing down and probably the walk back of a lot of some of the reform items which came forward in the previous government. And this simply has to do with the political interests of the new government, and also without an electoral manifesto or reform agenda which is underpinning the new coalition. I think there's a lot less momentum in that front, and so it remains to be seen how this will be handled by the new government. And finally, at the most broad level, I think there's a question of the stability of this new government as well. Over the past 5 years in Malaysia, we've seen more party hopping and coalition hopping and party switching that we've seen at the national level in a very long time, perhaps ever. So there's a question of whether or not this is the new future of Malaysia, where we're going to see a lot more of this fluidity between coalitions and between parties, and what that means for the ideological positioning of the parties, how the opposition can position itself vis-a-vis the new government, also will be dynamics to watch out for in the future. So I'm going to stop there. I know there's going to be a portion of Q&A and comments that I'll be able to respond to, so I look forward to hearing your input on this presentation. So thank you.